Thanks. I'd just like to make a comment about causes and effects at a sort of global level. It seems to me that there are two fundamental causes of the refugee problem, talking in historic terms. The first is the sort of deregulation of the world with the international trade treaties, which turned the world into a monopoly game for corporations, with governments becoming progressively less powerful and countries going up like the end of a monopoly game when the rich get obscenely richer and the poor get obscenely poorer. And this, of course, creates an immense gap across the world, which makes the borders extremely significant. The other thing is the non-demilitarization of the US with the taking over by the military and industrial complex of US foreign policy, so that unprovoked wars everywhere, particularly in the Middle East, that totally destabilised the world. So these two factors have led to a massive refugee spewing across the world. And of course, the response of the winners in the monopoly game have been to stick up borders and turn gated communities at a national level into gated nations at an international level. And I think we have to bear that driving ethos in mind and say that the refugee problems and the brutality associated with that is part of the enforcement of this overall world dynamic based on, I guess, neoliberal ideology. And I think we have to, Ian alluded to this, and I think it's very important. So whenever we talk about the causes, I think we have to discuss it at that level, because the refugees are, in a sense, a consequence of all these things happening. If there wasn't a war, there wouldn't be refugees, and so the anti-war movement, it gets overshadowed even by the refugee problem, which means the symptom is overshadowing the disease, if you really want to put it in blunt terms, right? So I think we have to bear that in mind as we try to act on this, because of course if you fix one problem, the other problems will still exist. So you need at least to sow the seed of the broader picture, even though we are totally, at the moment, confronting this problem. And to confront this problem, of course, Jacinda Ardern had promised 150, but she promised 150 per year, so technically she could take the 600 because 4 years have gone by. And the thing obstructing her, I think, there's two things. One is that the Australian government is in practice in control, although it naturally says it isn't, as you pointed out, and it's up. She could make a deal with the Papuans and tell the Australian government to take a running leap if she was willing. The only thing stopping her, of course, is New Zealand First and Winston Peters. So any lobbying of New Zealand needs to take into account, I believe, a petition to Winston Peters telling him that refugees did Australia good in the 1950s and 60s and could do New Zealand good now, and maybe he should adapt his policies to allow Jacinda Ardern to do things. So what I'm asking, I guess, is can the petitions for Jacinda Ardern also encompass New Zealand First, and perhaps get the New Zealand Greens to put their pushing in within the coalition in New Zealand to try and get action there?
Just one quick thing. I mean, I think we obviously very concerned to support people in New Zealand who are, fighting to push Ardern, to take more refugees and to deal directly with Papua New Guinea. But it's also something I alluded to in the beginning. So I think that one of the things which gets in the way, there's no reason not to fight it. Obviously, we do need to fight it. But it's telling that even New Zealand comes to Australia, and it's kind of, please, Mr. Turnbull, is this okay with you, Mr. Turnbull? Oh, so, well, we're just asking, no offence. And it is telling in terms of the degree in which Australia is able, to project its own, whether that's, economic power, its political power in the region, because in that sense, New Zealand has been suborned and is suborned. I mean, as long as Ardern doesn't go to Nauru directly and doesn't go to Manus Island directly, then they are complicit. She is complicit in what's happening on Manus Island. But I think it's one of the reasons why the movement here, needs to deal and understand we need to deal with the beast. We need to deal with Australia's role, because Australia has pulled Papua New Guinea, Nauru, Cambodia, and New Zealand into undermining refugee rights, and it's to all their shame. But there's a shameful beast in the middle of that called Malcolm Turnbull or the Australian government.
you want to answer that?
Well, just I guess to say that New Zealand has agreed to double its refugee intake under Ardern, so they, technically they could take all 600 this year.
What disturbs me really is the ability of the media to demonize the asylum seeker, and for the even general Australian public to agree to such demonization. The media scares Australians that these asylum seekers are either terrorists or out to steal your jobs. Which is a pathetic image, and it's even more pathetic that Australians swallow that storyline, hook, line, and sinker. When in fact, you've mentioned it, it takes more than $500,000 to maintain them. How much do we spend for New Start on each person and force them to work on the dole for less than minimum wage? And yet, we drive them to be scared of these asylum seekers when the government actually spends more, not on them, not on the asylum seekers, but on the cronies that operate these centers.
Hong Kong billionaires that are being charged with
Right.
fraud.
So how do we, my question is, how do we reverse or fight the demonization of our unfortunate asylum seekers who are actually victims of Australia's foreign policy alignment with neo-imperialism? Thank you.
Well, I think the way to, well, I guess two things. Do Australians really think that? That's what the government tells us Australians think. I'm not sure that that's totally true. I mean, I probably live in a bit of a bubble, but
Yeah, sometimes when I write the boss and I talk about it,
yeah.
and I get
People think
surprised.
people are incredibly concerned about what, when they find out what's happening on Madison Road. Of course, the government's tried to close it down. So, I'm not totally convinced that Australians have bought that. But the reality is when you do meet people, when you do, have an opportunity to touch their hearts, then that's the thing that changes people's minds. So, instead of people like me and Ian being up here, we've got to do all we can to raise up the voices of people who do have that lived experience. And at the Refugee Council, we're doing a lot of that work.
Ian, you want to go?
I think it raises an important point, and I think both Tim and I probably get reminded of the impressions among some Australians. Just before I came here, I actually had a phone call from Tony in South Australia, who was just full of abuse about what we're doing for Manus Island, standing up for refugees, and then the usual thing about charity sort of starts at home. And I think the thing about that is it's something in the refugee movement we do need to realise, because the government does play the blame game, and it does try to play one section of society off against another section of society. And it's a point that I try to make over and over and over again, that if the money that they were spending on Nauru and Manus Island was spent in the community, we'd have enough for the pensioners, we'd have enough for the students, we'd have enough for the people who are on the dole, and we'd have enough for refugees, as well. And to buy into the blame game is to buy into the process of seeing dividing us one against another. But it is an important point. I think and to get across to people actually that they would treat us like refugees. When I look at what happens on Manus Island, and I look what happened in Villawood and elsewhere, I think they would treat us exactly like that. If they could create a detention centre for pensioners to get them out of the way, where they didn't have to think about them anymore,
They're called age centres.
they would create it. They would create it. I mean, they've done it with Aboriginal people with greater or less extent for a long time. So we do need to bear it in mind. But I'm also with Tim. I think you look at some of the opinion polls. If you ask the straight out question, should Australia take people who should provide protection for people who are fleeing war and persecution, you get big majorities for all throughout the whole process. When you ask a question about a boat person, then you get a different kind of question, and that's where we do have some work to do to bridge that gap. But when Rudd was elected, we had big majorities for boat people. We had big majorities for closing Manus Island and Nauru. If we could do that in 2007, we can do it again. In fact, my feeling is that going into this election, when you look at those polls, they're going to be much more positive. They were than when we saw with Tony Abbott, because people start to see through the lies.
Yes.
I think it's pretty clear that the federal government has been bottlenecking this whole scenario and trying to collect as many people on the island as possible in those detention centres. My concern is that not only are we seeing corruption, 500,000 versus, imprisoning people in, terrible conditions, but still better conditions here in Australia. There's obvious corruption. I'm very worried about the privatisation of these detention centres. What would stop a business group buying up the detention centres and then using those workers as economic slaves to do casual work anywhere in the world, Australia, anywhere? And what you would have is people that are being tortured and abused becoming lifelong economic slaves. Now, so my grandfather was an itinerant worker from the islands. The thing is, at least he could choose where he went. He could come back and see his families. He had some capacity to make a modicum of money, right? He wasn't an economic slave, but itinerant workers was a poor lot, and he died early in his life, and he largely was absent for his family because it was such hard conditions. So we have that history in our family. Now, economic slavery is worse than that. It's worse than that. What I want to know is how we can make sure that those detention centres aren't privatised, and that what we don't have is people gaining private benefit, turning those people, those poor people that are trapped there, into economic slaves. And what can you do to stop that?
Okay. Look, I think, I understand where you're coming from, but I think the reality is that the detention centres have been privatised. Like they're run, it's run by Serco.
I'm talking about employment businesses.
Yes, no, I understand. I'll come to that in a tick. Yeah, so I think that's the first, they've done that. The detention centres themselves, I think there is a very real difficulty to turn them into the kind of thing that you're talking about, because it's one thing to do it in a prison, where someone knows that they're going to be there for 3 years, or 4 years.
It's not difficult. Okay, can I hear from the other speaker?
Yeah, well, I'll just finish first if you don't mind.
It's not.
Yeah, okay.
It's not.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you why I think it is. And that is because I said one thing to do it in a prison where someone thinks that they work for the boss, they work for the man, they're going to get a bit of time off their sentence. The detention centres work very differently. They're called factories of mental illness for a very real reason. And that the kinds of things which do allow them to create economic slaves in prisons, and you've got a prison industry in the United States which is horrendous, and we've got elements of it in Australia as well. Their capacity to do it with the people who are in the detention centres is very, very limited. So people like Serco or like Construct, people like Broad Spectrum, they make their money out of contracts with the Australian government, not out of the money which they abuse. That's why they're quite happy to run those people into the dirt. They're quite happy for them to be mental morons, created by the experience, in detention. If you're in a prison, you can't do that. You want someone who's capable of actually putting a widget on a gadget. People inside the detention centres very often aren't capable of doing that.
Sure. I think what we've seen is a really effective campaign run out of Australia on this by the No Business in Abuse mob, where they've really targeted originally Broad Spectrum, got them to change their name and got the CEO of the company then to step down. They became Transfield. Transfield had then been forced out. They got bought out by another. Well, sorry, it was the other way around. Transfield. Yeah, anyway, they have run a really effective campaign. It seems that long ago now because so much happens that it's past. And what we're seeing now is really dodgy operators starting to move into this, well, even dodgier operators starting to move into this space, small family-owned companies that don't have the same levels of accountability that some of the large companies have. Look, it's potentially a risk, and we certainly
a
not...
likely scenario.
It's happened in other places. We haven't seen it as yet. But I think with the rise of these small companies, like we saw going off to when Manus was closed, there was a company called Paladin Security who've been involved in all sorts of dodgy activities around the world. Flying in more than 40 security officers from Fiji. And again, it's how these centres operate in this legal grey zone. I mean, it was established around the Iraq War with Halliburton. That's kind of when all this stuff really kicked off in a big way. And the levels of accountability, I think, are the things that we really need to be focusing on and ensuring that they are in place. And they're clearly not in place in a place like Manus.
Can you have the next question, please?
Yeah, g'day, Brian Concannon. My question's slightly off topic. I was expecting Leroy Annan. I had a question sort of compared to Scott Ludlam and the dual citizen thing. So, what concerns me about the whole dual citizen thing, hopefully you guys can give me some sort of answer, is all the Jewish dual citizens. You got, if your mother, grandmother, great-grandmother is Jewish, that automatically makes you Jewish. You got Josh Frydenberg, Michael Danby, who seems to stick up for Israel matters more than he does for Australian. Who's the other one? Mark, the Attorney General. And apparently Malcolm Turnbull has a Jewish grandmother. Which it actually makes... It's anti-Zion. Free speech. What's wrong with free speech? We got some Jewish...
No, what's
They got a
the
dog in the
question?
fight. They got a dog in the fight, these two.
What is the question? Quickly.
Oh, just... I'm just concerned that there's about 5 or 6 of them and none of them have come forward and they're dual citizens. Is there a reason why? Are Jewish people above the law?
Okay, thank you.
Are they...
Thank
well,
you.
well,
No, I don't want to say that.
Do you want to say anything?
no.
I agree with all the people who are in the queue. I actually think this is just an anti-Semitic question. And it's just completely out of order in this particular grumping of people. And you can video me saying that. I'm quite happy for that to be wherever you want to portray it, because I think the reality is that the dual citizenship, the issue is a load of cobblers. I mean, why do I want Turnbull out? I mean, I don't care who his grandparents or his parents or anybody else is. I want him out because he's a Tory. I want him out because of what he does, what he actually represents for the issue of who actually runs Australia and what they do. Barnaby Joyce, I don't care if Barnaby Joyce is a Kiwi. Right? I don't want him out of the government because he's a Kiwi. I want him out because of what he represents in terms of the National Party, the fact that they're willing to preside over what happens inside the detention centres and all the rest of it. In fact, I think the stuff about the dual citizenship is a complete farce. People should be able to elect who they want to elect. Actually, if I had an opportunity, I would like to run Baruz Bachani as a prime ministerial candidate. Right? I think we want to know the people who I think we could have a chance to actually vote in and accept. They could come from anywhere. Our concern is, do they represent our interests? Are they going to fight for our side? The question of nationality, and particularly coming from you, talking about whether the people are, sort of Jewish or otherwise, I think is an anti-Semitic rant and has got absolutely no place in this discussion.
It's freedom of speech, and are they above the law?
Next question, please.
Right. Look, these events are very good and very valuable. I think some of us need to know also what we can really do. Where it might be a weak spot or somewhere where we can get in there and make a bit of a change. I think, as in 1999 with East Timor, I think we should listen to the ABC and listen to how they're reporting things, and ring them up 9333 1500 when they do something wrong, which is often on East Timor, on the hostage crisis in Manus. They are often putting like the bloody dual citizenship rubbish first, and instead of the main human rights violation, which is Manus and Nauru and all the rest of it. And also you can ring them up to congratulate them, like when they put Greg Bounds on this morning, which was great. But this is a hostage crisis, which normally a hostage crisis is reported day by day by day. And we can look at other groups that hassle the media. Are they successful? I'm not going to mention them because this jerk has just fucking crawled the fucking bitch fuck off. And anyway, but there are other groups that hassle the media, and they're also very successful. We should do it. We should do it in the cause of truth and justice. That's what you should hassle the ABC for, to tell the truth, which they do not often do. Okay, and that's really all I've got to say. and during the Iranian hostage crisis, it took 444 days. The Americans were locked up in Iran. How do we know that? Because it was a hostage crisis reported every single day. And that's what manners should be. That's what we should be demanding of the ABC. Not because both parties agree on the torture of refugees. That is not a reason for not fucking reporting it, excuse my French. They should be reporting it every day adequately. And if they're not, and in my opinion they're not, we should phone them on 9333 1500, congratulate them where credit is due, but tell them how they should be reporting it, what their journalistic values should be, which is about humanity. Thank you.
So that's a wonderful comment. So can we have the next question, please?
A question, a comment. In the infamous phone conversation between Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and US President Donald Trump, expressed the view that you Australians have a real thing about boat people, don't you? Why is that? What is this thing that you have about boat people? Which begs the question, is Australia's inhumane, cruel, sadistic torture of people legally seeking sanctuary in Australia, refugees arriving by boat, a form of perverse national psychopathology, a projection onto boat people of our unresolved, repressed, collective guilt over our treatment of Australia's First Peoples, with refugees arriving by boat standing in for the invading Europeans of the 18th and 19th centuries, who also arrived by boat, and we, the native-born, standing in for the First Peoples fearful of dispossession. And is a sane national refugee policy perhaps linked and can only be achieved once Australians have confronted their dark past?
Look, as I said in the introduction, I think that there is a connection. I think you can't really understand the depths of the racism that we have in our own rulers and the political parties, but I include the Labor Party and Liberal Party, without understanding white Australia and what it meant both for the dispossession of the Indigenous people and also as a white outpost of European colonialism in Asia. I mean and I didn't get onto it in the introduction, but I think you look at the way in which it is systematically used at the moment about border protection, about national security, of linking the questions of terrorism, and so I mean it's inescapable that the way the attitude to asylum seekers and boat arrivals is connected to that. That in turn is inextricably linked to Australia's origins. I mean ultimately I think as someone said earlier, I mean if you're trying to look at how the thing is going to be addressed kind of fundamentally, I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's a matter of drawing those connections. No matter that we can rectify the issue with Indigenous people, and that will mean something in terms of the way asylum seekers, things are treated. I think we need to be careful not to see them as divided, but something that there's inextricably linked. If we're going to deal with the racism and the xenophobia that is directed at the boat people, we have to look at the racism which is created in terms of the attitude to the Indigenous people as well. They're part of the same struggle. We may emphasise one or the other at different kinds of terms. It's quite important that we actually recognise the need to link them both in the fight.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think they're absolutely linked. And you speak to most Indigenous people, they're very welcoming of refugees. They can laugh about the fact that, most of us came here on boats and see the absolute irony in it. And it's an absolute conflict that I think exists at the heart of our population in Australia, and we do have to deal with it, but we have to deal with both elements of it. I think you see a member of Parliament being abused in a pub down in Melbourne on the weekend, Dastiari, or last night. I mean, it's appalling, the rise of this, but we have to all take collective action against those people. And the things we can do is when we see it, we need to call it out exactly when we see it, and we need to model the sort of behaviour we want.
Yes, well, on that subject, I was collecting petitions for the bus campaign at Central Station last Saturday night, and ex-British man of National Front extraction basically said to me, I'm not going to sign anything that's authorised by Jamie Parker because he wants to dump the refugees at Callan Park. I said, he doesn't want to do that. They want to resettle some of them there temporarily so they can get their feet on the ground. And he just basically said, F off or I'm going to punch you out. So there is racism around, sure. Now, I wanted to refer back to some of you who might be old enough at Politics in the Pub to remember a Bangladeshi cab driver by the name of Ahmed Farouk, who took a racist DJ, Shock Jock, Jim Ball, to court over his banning from his program on 2GB and cost 2GB quite a lot of money in court before he died. And while Stephen's great on the ABC, ring them up and pat them on the back and criticise them when they're respectively good or bad, I think we shouldn't let the Daily Telegraph and 2GB, particularly Ray Hadley and probably Alan Jones, off the hook, and Chris Smith. We should be continually ringing 131 873 and trying to get through and playing along for a minute or two as a moderate and then hammering them, knowing they have the 7-second delay button, and saying, basically pushing our line on what is a subsidised public airwave, not just the ABC, all the public licences of the commercial networks are subsidised by the taxpayers. So let's try and hammer away and letters to the editor of the Daily Telegraph and the local rags all the time. And when they don't get published, send them off to Media Watch and crikey.com and get up and say, I wrote this letter, it was not published, and put it up on your Facebook page. So the cumulative media censorship becomes known. Now, my question to the panel, without mentioning that I'm the convener of the second anti-conscription centenary here on Sunday, December the 3rd for the cameras. My question to the panel relates to the media coverage on, I think it was Channel 7 or 9 or 10 2 days ago, and it might have been a photo in the Australian as well, showing the $2.3 million centre all set up with a health centre, a childcare centre, and everything else you could want, where they want to ship these 600 guys with their crossed arms on American television, but not on Australian television, who have now got 2 days to move out because it's unsanitary, which is what the PNG government's saying. It's been unsanitary for the last 2 years. But they're going to ship them out by force by the same people, the PNG Navy, that was firing machine guns at them 6 months ago. No wonder they don't want to move. But the Australian media can't get in, except for the odd one or two, to where they currently are. But apparently they can get their TV cameras in to show the glossy $2.3 million Australian subsidised centre where they're supposed to be going. Can you guys reflect on how dangerous that new centre will be? Is it true they may face attack from locals, or is it a beat up by the 600 asylum seekers? Thank you for my long question.
Look, I guess there has been violence perpetrated against asylum seekers and refugees on Manus, absolutely, but the vast majority of Manusians are not particularly violent or aggressive towards asylum seekers. Again, I think you can lay the blame here really at the feet of the Australian government, because they have not done any work in the community to try and smooth the way. What they've done is said, keep away from the asylum seekers, keep away from the refugees, they're dangerous, they've locked them up in this prison, all sorts of rumours have shifted around them. And there's fear on both sides, and there's been no effort by the Australian government to smooth the way. And that is of enormous concern. There's some great leadership being shown by Papua New Guineans who want to support refugees. But ultimately, this is not Papua New Guinea's problem. This is Australia's problem, and we need to resolve it. And we should not forget that. And just moving them to another centre is not going to resolve the issue. It's just going to turn a blind eye. The Australian media that is covering it at the moment will turn away, and these people will be forgotten. And we cannot let that happen.
What about the New Zealand offer? Are you guys cynical about that? The fact that Australia won't take up the... You've already had your question.
Yeah, look, I think there is no doubt, and people shouldn't be in any doubt, that the fears that people have about moving out of the detention centre into the Lorengau community are real. And that it's not a question of the facilities that are in East Lorengau in that respect. That people can, there is place that is purpose-built. It does look like a motel. But the reality is that since that place has been there 2 years, there have been, many attacks, on people for their mobile phones, for the few kina they might have in their pocket, or for wherever else. And people have seen in the news the scale of those attacks. Those fears, are real. But it's not just a matter of that. I mean, the thing is that what the government is attempting to do at the moment is not just move them into areas that are, more unsafe than where they are in the detention centre, but the administration is gone. Right, there will be no easy way in which even the medical facilities are going to be, medical needs are going to be able to be met. There will be one GP clinic, they say, that will operate in business hours at one of the facilities, which is not really in walking distance from the other two that have been set up. Out of those hours, and for their general treatment, they'll have to use the Lorengau Hospital. Now, I can't think of how to describe the Lorengau Hospital, but for the guy who had the heart attack, a couple of days ago on Manus, they not only did Lorengau not have drugs and not have the capacity, didn't have an ECG, they could take the blood pressure, that was all that they could do, but they had the facilities don't exist in Papua New Guinea to actually do the kind of things that we would take as standard kind of treatment. The drugs that people have got that are prescribed for them are not available in the pharmacy at Lorengau. There's no way to administer those things. The food, people in East Lorengau, they get 100 kina a week, which is about $50, and that is not enough for them to eat. There's not enough for them to survive. There are two rations of food that are taken into East Lorengau each week. Now, the people who are moving out, are being pushed out of the detention centre, are being told you are going to get exactly the same. Now, they know that they can't live on that. But more to the point, they say we have been here 4 years, over 4 years. People have been found to be refugees. Where is our permanent visa? Where is our safe resettlement? We're not going to move from one detention centre to another detention centre because it's the whim of the Papua New Guinea government. If we move, it's actually to get the permanent settlement and the secure protection that we actually need. That's what's at stake on Manus Island. It's not just a question of that mistreatment, but the Australian government is actually trying to gloss over the thing completely. They want to bury the people who are on Manus Island. They want to say that it's Papua New Guinea's responsibility, but the fundamental issue is where is the protection? Where is the permanent visa? Where is the safe country that they can get resettled? Australia hasn't got an answer. Papua New Guinea hasn't got an answer.
Yeah, thanks very much to the panel. Very interesting discussion. I wanted to sort of raise it to the broader level of where, what is the future in regard to the refugee movement and the whole status of refugees in the world. We are looking at a refugee crisis, and I would say actually we haven't seen anything yet. We are looking in the future where the governments, Labor and Liberal, are putting fingers in the dike to stop a present situation, but the refugee crisis, the way things are going, is going to be on a scale massively higher than what we have now. We haven't even begun to think about the question of climate refugees, which is actually going to be an incredibly major thing coming down the line. The other aspect which I thought maybe you could reflect upon is the fact that our policy is totally contradictory. On the one hand, we fight wars which create the refugees, and then we try to stop the refugees from coming to Australia. And this is the history, the Iraq War, the Afghan War, our attitude to Sri Lanka. We have, in each case, supported the regimes which have, and we've been directly involved, in fact we are directly involved even now in Syria, in creating more refugees, and we're also in creating climate change. So we have a complete contradiction. I think that part of our challenge for the refugee movement is related to the whole political movement. How are we going to tackle the question of war and climate and the political struggle and economic struggle that's going on to try to allow people to actually stay in their own homeland and be able to stay in their own homeland. And we have to tackle both sides of it. So one is the refugees when they come, but the other is to change our policy. We're even cutting our foreign aid budget, which, actually contradicts the refugee policy. So I suppose I'm just asking, would you like to reflect on the whole situation which is creating the refugees and where our governments are contributing to, and how we can link up the growing, and I think maybe, Ian might like to talk about where the refugee movement is at the moment, that I think it's actually growing at the moment, and what they think about that. So, yeah, and how are we going to tackle these growing forces going to happen in the future?
Thank you. Do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I mean, there's always the $64 or $64,000 question. Look, there's no argument with me. I mean, ultimately, if we have to deal with the question of refugees, we've got to deal with the system that creates refugees. I mean, that seems to me to be an obvious issue. That you look at where the people do come, what they are fleeing, and as Jim's rightly said, lots of times, most of the times, they are fleeing war. Their persecution in Australia is actually directly, involved in it. It's like we were saying before. It's not a matter of choosing, one or the other. I mean, I think that if you are pro-refugee, then you have to be anti-war, and the same, and vice versa. If you're anti-war, you've got to be, pro-refugee, and that applies to so many things. And I think it's part of how we try to weld those things together. I mean, the refugee movement, where are we at the moment? Like the crisis around Manus, I think, has given us an opportunity to take another step forward. I think one of the things that the refugee movement has done as far as Australian society is concerned, I think it has established a bedrock. I mean, there's not a lot of successes that we can point to in a lot of respects, but I think one of the successes is one of the ones we don't recognise so often, that there is a bedrock in Australian society which does understand the question of refugees. I mean, I invite people to think about what Australia would look like if there hadn't been a refugee movement, if a movement hadn't been created, out in the late 90s in response to Pauline Hanson, in response to Howard's move. I mean, things could have been started much earlier. I don't know about Tim, but I was involved in bibs and bobs around when mandatory detention first came in, etc., etc. But you can imagine what the last 17 odd years, what the Australian society would look like if there wasn't a refugee movement. Now, I'm quite committed to, and that's why I made the point about the dying days of the Turnbull government, because it's not a matter. In 2007, there was a big argument in the refugee movement. Big sections of the refugee movement folded because they thought Labor was going to do it for them. That they was going to get the children out of detention, that the offshore, the detention centres were going to close, all the rest of it. And I'll tell you a little secret here. I mean, there were times in which a couple of us sat in the RAC meetings, and there'd be 2 or 3 people, for some weeks, actually for some months, in 2007, because so many of the people actually thought it was a question of voting for Labor. That doesn't exist at the moment. I don't know a section of the refugee movement, because of that experience, but because the movement went on to fight, that actually thinks we can shut up shop because Bill Shorten is going to be elected. Right? No one thinks that anymore. And I think we need to develop that, because the refugee movement goes up and then it plateaus, it gets a chance to go up again. But I think that's why the political arguments actually matter a lot about what we understand about what kind of outcome that we want, what kind of refugee policy actually means. That's why I do think it's, like I tried to say in the beginning, the questions about a humanitarian policy. I think not just about closing the detention centres. They need to close, and those aspects of it. But the question of whether Australia actually welcomes the boats. People do come here by boat. It's not a matter of insisting that people have to come here by boat. There's plenty that Australia could do and should do. If they can have the ships that can stop boats getting here, they can have the ships that can help boats get here. If they could process people in Indonesia, they could guarantee resettlement out of Indonesia, so people wouldn't have to get on boats. There's a lot of things which can actually be done. But to understand that issue, that if a genuine humanitarian policy has to mean that no matter how people come here, when they come here, whether it's by boat or anything else, there has to be a welcome policy when they actually arrive, and that's what we have to hold the Labor Party to when we get rid of the Turnbull government, and we will continue to hold them in the same kind of way. We will fight them as hard as we fought Turnbull. If Manus isn't closed, if Nauru isn't closed, if we don't get rid of mandatory detention, if we don't get the 30,000, if we don't get the permanent visas for the 30,000, if we don't get the relief for the people who are here from Manus and Nauru, then we'll need to keep fighting as hard as we fought Turnbull.
Okay, that concludes today's session at Politics in the Pub. Anyway, you can discuss later. So that concludes this session of Politics in the Pub. So will you please join me in thanking the two speakers for their wonderful speech as well as their wonderful answers.